She won't live long enough to spend it anyway, my son-in-law whispered, just loud enough for me to hear as the attorney adjusted his glasses and prepared to read my late husband's will, and in that quiet, carpeted room that smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, something inside me didn't shatter the way you might expect, it simply went still, as if every illusion I had been holding onto for years had quietly folded in on itself. I didn't turn my head, I didn't let my expression change, I just kept my hands folded neatly in my lap, the same hands that had spent decades building a life beside my husband, raising our daughter, helping that very man sitting across from me start his own career when he had nothing but debt and charm, and yet there he was, leaning back in his chair like he already owned the room, like he was simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up with what he believed was inevitable. I could feel my daughter Emily beside him, her posture stiff, her eyes fixed somewhere ahead as if she had trained herself not to see me, not to hear what had just been said, and that silence, her silence, settled heavier on my chest than his words ever could. The attorney cleared his throat and began speaking in that careful, measured tone professionals use when discussing things that change lives, but I found myself watching smaller details instead, the way Daniel's fingers tapped lightly against the armrest, impatient, the way his lips curled ever so slightly when certain assets were mentioned, the house, the accounts, the investments my husband and I had spent over 40 years building one careful decision at a time. It was all being reduced to figures and legal language, and to him, it was already his. I could see it in the way he didn't even bother to hide his anticipation, as if I were already gone, as if I were nothing more than a delay. I remembered the first time he came into our lives, polite, attentive, calling me Mrs. Whitmore. With that easy smile, asking for advice, thanking me for dinners, for support, for the loan that helped him stabilize his business during those early uncertain months. I remembered how proud Emily had been, how convinced I was that she had chosen someone who would protect her, someone who would value family the way we did, and now here we were, sitting in a room meant to honor my husband's legacy, and all I could hear was the quiet calculation in a whisper that was never meant to be answered. I adjusted the sleeve of my navy dress, the one I had chosen carefully that morning because it felt appropriate, respectful, something Robert would have liked, and I kept my gaze forward, listening, observing, saying nothing, because in that moment, I understood something with a clarity that surprised even me. They weren't waiting to see what the will said, they were waiting for me to become irrelevant, and for the first time, I let them believe it, completely. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is let people think you've already lost before the game has even begun. The reading continued in that steady, almost detached rhythm, legal terms flowing one after another, but I noticed something that had not been there before, a subtle shift in Daniel's posture when the attorney mentioned a clause that required all assets to remain under my direct control for an unspecified period of time. His tapping stopped, just for a second, and his eyes flicked toward Emily, who gave him the smallest shake of her head, as if to tell him to stay quiet, to wait, and that moment, brief as it was, told me more than anything else that they had not been expecting this, that whatever plans they had quietly built together were not unfolding the way they thought they would. I kept my gaze forward, my expression calm, but inside, I began to trace back through the last year, the small conversations that had once seemed harmless. The way Daniel had asked about estate taxes over dinner as if it were casual curiosity, the way Emily had suggested I simplify my finances because it would be less stressful at my age, the way they had both gently encouraged me to consider downsizing, to think about a retirement community with more support. Each suggestion had been wrapped in concern, in soft voices and reassuring smiles, and I had accepted them at face value because that is what you do with family. You trust that concern means care, not strategy. But now, sitting in that room, I could see the pattern clearly. Each conversation was not a moment, it was a step, and I had been standing at the end of a path I did not even know I was walking. The attorney paused briefly to turn a page, and in that silence, Daniel leaned slightly closer to Emily, his voice low, but not low enough. "It is temporary," he muttered. "It always is," and Emily did not respond, she just kept her eyes fixed ahead, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, and I wondered then if she had convinced herself of the same thing, that time would solve this, that patience would turn everything in their favor. I felt no urge to confront them, no sudden wave of anger, only a quiet, steady awareness settling into place, like a puzzle finally revealing its full picture. I had spent years believing that love within a family was something stable, something that did not need to be questioned, but now I understood that silence can hide many things, and kindness can be mistaken for weakness if it is given without limits. The attorney resumed speaking, outlining responsibilities, conditions, and timelines, and with each word, I saw Daniel's confidence flicker, not disappear, but adjust, recalibrate, as if he were already finding a new way forward, and that realization stayed with me, because it meant this was not over, not for him, and not for me either. I shifted slightly in my chair, smoothing the fabric of my dress. Once more, and for the first time since entering that room, I allowed myself a single, quiet thought that felt almost unfamiliar in its clarity. I would not rush, I would not argue, and I would not explain anything. I would simply watch. Because people always reveal more than they intend to when they believe no one is paying attention, and in that moment, I decided that I would be paying attention to everything. I did not say anything when the attorney finally closed the folder and announced that a full copy of the will would be sent to each of us within 3 business days. I simply nodded once, slow and polite, the way I had done my entire life in rooms where I was expected to be composed. Daniel stood almost immediately, offering that same practiced smile he had worn for years, the one that suggested confidence without ever quite reaching his eyes. Well, that was informative, he said, stretching the word as if testing it, and I watched the way he glanced at the attorney before turning back to Emily, his expression tightening just slightly when he thought no one was looking. Emily rose beside him, smoothing her coat, avoiding my gaze entirely, and that avoidance felt louder than any argument ever could have, because it confirmed what I had already begun to understand, that silence between us was no longer neutral, it was chosen, deliberate. The hallway outside the office was quiet, lined with framed certificates and soft lighting that made everything feel calm, almost respectful. But the air shifted the moment we stepped out. Daniel leaned closer to Emily again, his voice low but edged with something sharper now. We will figure it out, he said, there is always a way. And Emily finally responded, her voice barely above a whisper. Just not here, she said, glancing briefly in my direction before looking away again. As if even the possibility of me hearing them made her uncomfortable, I adjusted my purse on my shoulder, taking my time, letting them walk a few steps ahead, not because I felt left behind, but because distance has a way of revealing things that closeness can hide, and as I watched them from behind, their heads angled toward each other, their steps synchronized in that quiet, private rhythm couples develop, I realized something that settled into me with unexpected clarity. I was no longer part of that rhythm, not in the way I once believed, and perhaps I had not been for quite some time. The elevator ride down was silent. The kind of silence that feels intentional rather than accidental. Daniel checked his phone, Emily stared at the numbers above the door as they changed one by one, and I stood between them, still, composed. As if I were simply another stranger sharing the space. When the doors opened, the cool afternoon air met us, carrying the faint scent of rain, and for a brief moment, no one moved. Then Daniel stepped forward, holding the door open with a gesture that might have looked courteous to anyone watching, but I noticed the impatience in the way his fingers tapped against the metal frame. We should get lunch, he said casually, as if nothing had shifted, as if the room we had just left had not revealed anything at all. Emily nodded quickly, too quickly. Yes, that sounds good, she replied, still not looking at me, and then there was that pause, that small, almost invisible hesitation before she added, Mom, do you want to join us? The words were correct, polite even, but the tone lacked warmth, lacked invitation. It felt like obligation, something said because it should be said, not because it was meant. I met her eyes then, just for a second, long enough to see the uncertainty there, the flicker of something she was trying not to feel, and I gave a small smile, calm and steady. Not today, I said, my voice even. I have a few things to take care of. Daniel nodded quickly, relief flashing across his face before he masked it again. Of course, he said, already turning slightly toward the street, already moving on, and as I watched them walk away together, their conversation resuming in low tones, I did not feel abandoned. I felt aware, more aware than I had been in years, because for the first time, I was no longer trying to hold on to something that had already changed. I was simply seeing it for what it was, and that changed everything. Instead of going home, I asked the driver to take me to the old neighborhood, the one we had lived in before everything became larger, before the accounts grew and the house expanded into something that felt more like a statement than a home. And as the car moved through familiar streets, I found myself watching the details I had not paid attention to in years. The small front yards, the worn sidewalks, the modest porches where people still sat in the late afternoon light, talking without hurry, without calculation. I Remembered when Robert and I first moved there, how we counted every dollar, how we planned everything carefully, not because we were afraid, but because we respected what it meant to build something from nothing. And I remembered how, over time, that careful way of living had shifted into something else, something quieter, more comfortable, but also easier to take for granted. The driver slowed as we turned onto our old street, and I asked him to stop just for a moment. I did not get out, I simply sat there, looking at the small house that had once held every version of our life, the early years, the long nights, the laughter, the arguments that never lasted, and the steady understanding that whatever we built together. I thought about the last few years, about how often Daniel had visited, how easily he had stepped into conversations about money, about investments, about what was smart and what was outdated, always careful, always respectful on the surface, and how I had allowed those conversations to continue without questioning their direction, because it felt natural to trust someone who spoke with confidence, someone who seemed invested in the family's future. I closed my eyes briefly, recalling the first time he had asked about the structure of our accounts, how Robert had answered openly, without hesitation, proud of what we had managed to create, and I realized now that information, once given, does not simply disappear, it settles, it gathers, it becomes something that can be used later in ways you never intended. The driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror, waiting, and I gave a small nod for him to continue. As we pulled away, I did not feel regret. Not in the way I once might have. I felt clarity, the kind that comes too late to change the past but arrives just in time to shape what comes next. Because the truth was, nothing Daniel said that day had come out of nowhere. It had been building, quietly, patiently, through every conversation I had dismissed as harmless, every suggestion I had accepted as helpful, every moment I had chosen comfort over question. And as the city shifted around me, growing busier, louder, more distant from the quiet street we had just left, I understood that what I was dealing with was not a sudden betrayal, it was a pattern that had been forming right in front of me, hidden in plain sight, and the most unsettling part was not that I had missed it, but that I had trusted it enough not to look closer. I rested my hands in my lap again, the same calm posture I had held in that office, but now it carried a different meaning, because this time, the stillness was not about enduring, it was about preparing. And for the first time since Robert was gone, I was no longer thinking about what I had lost, I was thinking about what I still controlled, and how quietly, how carefully, I would decide to use it the next morning. I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had somewhere urgent to be, but because my mind had already settled into a new rhythm, one that no longer drifted through memories but moved with quiet intention. I made my coffee the same way I always had, measuring carefully, waiting for the slow drip, listening to the familiar sounds that once felt like routine but now felt grounding, and as I stood by the kitchen window, watching the pale morning light stretch across the backyard, I realized how much of my life had been built on consistency, on doing things the same way because it felt right, because it created stability, and yet stability, when left unexamined, can become something others learn to depend on in ways you never intended. I carried my cup to the table and sat down, not with the newspaper as I used to, but with a small leather folder I had not opened in years. Inside were documents Robert and I had reviewed together countless times, accounts, agreements, notes, written in his careful handwriting, and as I flipped through the pages, I could almost hear his voice, steady and practical, reminding me that understanding your own life is the only way to protect it. I paused on a page marked with a thin blue tab, one I vaguely remembered but had not thought about in a long time. It outlined a set of conditions tied to certain assets, language that at the time had seemed overly cautious, almost unnecessary, but now, reading it again, I saw something different. Not just protection, but foresight, a recognition that circumstances change and that trust, while important, should never be blind. I set the folder down for a moment, letting that thought settle, because what had happened yesterday was not just about one careless whisper, it was about the assumption behind it, the certainty that I would not question, that I would not act, that I would simply continue as I always had, predictable, accommodating, easy to manage. I stood up and walked toward the study, a room that had once been Robert's and had slowly become a place I visited less and less, not out of fear, but because it held too many reminders of a time when decisions were shared, when I did not have to carry them alone. I opened the drawer of his desk and took out a small notebook, the one where he used to jot down thoughts that did not belong in formal documents, and as I flipped through it, I found a line that made me stop, written in his familiar script, simple and direct. Never assume people will act as you would, prepare for what they might do instead. I closed the notebook gently, holding it for a moment longer than necessary, and then I set it back in place, because I understood now that what I needed was not comfort, it was clarity. I returned to the table, picked up the folder again, and this time, I read every line with attention, not as a formality, but as a strategy, noting what could be adjusted, what could be reinforced, what could be moved entirely, and for the first time in a long while, I did not feel like I was reacting to something that had already happened. I felt like I was stepping ahead of it, quietly, deliberately, without announcing a single intention, because the truth was, Daniel and Emily were not expecting resistance, they were expecting time to work in their favor, and as I closed the folder and finished the last sip of my coffee, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile, not out of satisfaction, but out of understanding, because time, when used correctly, does not belong to those who wait, it belongs to those who prepare. Later that afternoon, I made a call I had not needed to make in years, not because the option was not there, but because I had never seen a reason to use it. The number was still written on a small card inside the leather folder, unchanged, precise, and when the receptionist answered, her voice professional and calm, I introduced myself without hesitation. "This is Margaret Whitmore," I said, and there was a brief pause on the other end before her tone shifted, just slightly, into something more attentive. "Of course, Mrs. Whitmore. How may we assist you today?" I requested a private appointment. Nothing urgent in my voice, nothing that suggested concern, only a quiet certainty, and within a few minutes, it was arranged for the following morning. I ended the call and set the phone down gently, noticing how natural the action felt, as if I had simply resumed something I had paused long ago. The rest of the day moved slowly, deliberately. I went through the house room by room, not with nostalgia, but with observation, noting what was mine, what had been shared, what carried value beyond sentiment, and what had been quietly assumed by others to be theirs in time. I opened drawers, reviewed documents, checked account statements that I had not personally examined in detail for years, not because I lacked awareness, but because I had trusted the structure we had built, and now I was not dismantling it, I was understanding it fully again, piece by piece. In the early evening, Emily called, her name appearing on the screen with a familiarity that once brought comfort. I let it ring twice before answering. "Hi, Mom," she said, her voice careful, measured. "I just wanted to check in, see how you are doing after everything." I could hear Daniel faintly in the background, not speaking, but present, and that alone told me this call was not entirely hers. "I am doing well," I replied, my tone steady. "It was a long day, but everything is clear." There was a brief silence, the kind that usually invites explanation, but I did not offer any. Emily filled it quickly. "Daniel thinks it might be a good idea for us to sit down together soon, just to go over things, make sure everything is organized." I almost smiled at the phrasing, how neatly concern and intention can be wrapped together. "That will not be necessary right now," I said, not unkindly, just firm enough to settle the suggestion without creating tension. She hesitated, and I could sense her recalculating, adjusting to a response she had not expected. "Okay," she said finally, "I just thought it could help." "I appreciate that," I replied, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, the distance between us no longer filled with assumptions, only with what was actually there. "We will talk soon," she added, and I agreed, ending the call without prolonging it. I set the phone down and returned to the quiet of the house, the evening light softening the edges of everything around me, and I realized that this was the first time in a long while that I was not reacting to someone else's expectations. I was setting my own pace, choosing what to engage with and what to leave untouched, and as I prepared for the next morning, gathering the documents I would need, organizing them with the same care I had once used in building our life, I understood that what I was doing was not dramatic, not sudden, it was controlled, precise, and most importantly, unseen, because the strongest position is not the one that announces itself, it is the one that forms quietly while everyone else believes nothing has changed. The next morning, I arrived 10 minutes early, not out of habit, but because I wanted to sit in that quiet space before anything was said, to observe without interruption. The office was different from the one where the will had been read, smaller, more private, with soft grey walls and a single window that let in just enough light to make everything feel precise rather than warm. I placed my folder on the desk in front of me and rested my hands over it, steady, composed, and when the door opened, Mr. Reynolds stepped in with a look that was both professional and familiar. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, offering a slight nod as he took his seat. "I was not expecting to hear from you so soon." I returned the nod, my expression calm. "Neither was I replied, and that seemed to tell him enough, because he did not ask unnecessary questions. He simply opened his notebook and waited, giving me the space to begin. I slid the folder toward him, not dramatically, just enough for him to understand that this was not a casual visit. "I would like to review everything," I said. "Not just what was read yesterday, but all of it." He glanced at the documents, then back at me, his eyes sharpening slightly with interest. "Of course," he said, "we can go through each section in detail, and for the next hour, that is exactly what we did, line by line, clause by clause, nothing rushed, nothing assumed." I asked questions I had not asked before, not because I did not understand, but because I wanted to hear the answers again, clearly, without distraction. And as we moved through the documents, I noticed the same thing I had sensed the day before: small protections woven into the structure, conditions that required consent, timelines that limited access, safeguards that, when viewed together, created a framework far stronger than it appeared at first glance. Mr. Reynolds paused at one point, tapping lightly on a section with his pen. "Your husband was very thorough," he said. "He anticipated more than most people do." I held his gaze for a moment. "He always did," I replied, and there was a brief silence, one that did not feel uncomfortable, only understood. I leaned back slightly, considering everything we had reviewed, and then I spoke again, my voice even. "I would like to make some adjustments," I said, not as a question, but as a statement. His expression did not change, but I could see the shift in his attention, the way professionals recognize a moment when something moves from review to action. "What kind of adjustments?" he asked, and I folded my hands once more, choosing my words carefully, not out of hesitation, but precision. "I want to ensure that control remains exactly where it is," I said, "and that any assumptions about future access are corrected." He nodded slowly, understanding more than I needed to explain. "That can be arranged," he said, and as he began outlining the options, the legal pathways, the necessary steps, I listened without interruption, taking in each detail, not as information, but as tools, because that was what this had become: not a reaction, not a defense, but a quiet restructuring, one that would not announce itself, one that would not invite discussion, but one that would change the outcome in ways no one else was expecting. And when the meeting ended, I gathered my folder, thanked him, and stepped back out into the daylight, the air cool and steady, and for the first time since that whisper in the room, I did not feel like I was being watched. I felt like I was the one observing, and that difference, subtle as it was, made all the difference in what would come next that evening. I did something I had not done in a long time. I invited them over, not with urgency, not with explanation, just a simple message sent in the same calm tone I had used for years. "Dinner at my place on Sunday at 6, no added context, no emotional weight." And when Emily responded within minutes with a quick "of course, Mom," followed by Daniel's separate message confirming they would be there, I could almost feel the quiet curiosity behind their replies, the subtle shift from assumption to attention, because uncertainty has a way of drawing people closer when they believe something may be changing. I spent the next 2 days preparing, not in a grand or elaborate way, but with precision. I chose the table setting carefully, the same china I had used for family gatherings before, polished and arranged with deliberate care. I planned the menu based on what they liked, not out of kindness alone, but because familiarity lowers defenses. It creates an environment where people speak more freely, where they forget to be cautious. Sunday arrived without interruption, the afternoon quiet and steady. And as the time approached, I moved through the house with a sense of clarity that felt almost unfamiliar, not because I had never been organized, but because this time, every detail had purpose beyond appearance. When the doorbell rang exactly at 6, I took a breath, not to steady myself, but to mark the moment. And then I opened the door with the same composed smile I had worn in that office. Daniel stood slightly behind Emily, holding a bottle of wine, his expression warm, practiced. "We thought this might go well with dinner," he said, and I accepted it with a nod. "Thank you," I replied, stepping aside to let them in. Emily leaned in briefly, a quick embrace that felt more like a gesture than a connection. "The house looks beautiful," she said, glancing around, and I noticed the way her eyes moved, not lingering, just observing, taking in the space as if it were something to be assessed rather than simply experienced. We moved to the dining room, the table set exactly as I had planned, everything in its place, nothing out of line, and as we sat down, the conversation began the way it always does, light, polite, centered on safe topics, the weather, a recent trip, small updates that carried no real weight. But beneath that surface, I could feel it, the waiting, the quiet expectation that at some point, the conversation would shift, that I would say something about the will, about the meeting, about what I intended to do next. Daniel asked a few casual questions, carefully phrased. "Have you had time to go through everything?" he said at one point, his tone neutral, but his eyes attentive. I placed my fork down gently before answering, not immediately, just enough of a pause to let the question settle in the room. "I have," I said, my voice even, and I left it there, no elaboration, no explanation, and that was when I saw it, the brief exchange of glances between them, the subtle recalculation, because they had expected more, expected openness, expected access, and instead, they were met with something else entirely, something they had not prepared for, and as the dinner continued, the conversation circling, probing without being direct, I remained exactly as I had been from the beginning, calm, composed, offering nothing more than what I chose to give, because the truth was, this was no longer about what they knew, it was about what they did not, and the more they tried to understand without being told, the more clearly I could see just how much they had already assumed the moment came quietly, not with raised voices or sudden tension, but with the kind of stillness that settles just before something shifts. Daniel had just finished a sentence about how important it was to keep things simple moving forward, his tone light, almost helpful, when I placed my napkin neatly beside my plate and looked at both of them, not with accusation, not with emotion, but with a clarity that no longer needed to be softened. "I met with Mr. Reynolds," I said, and that was all it took. The room did not change, but they did. Daniel's posture straightened almost imperceptibly, Emily's fingers tightened slightly around her glass, and for a brief second, neither of them spoke. As if they were waiting to understand exactly what that meant before responding, I let the silence sit, not as a tactic, but as a natural part of the moment, and then I continued. We reviewed everything in detail. My voice remained steady, measured, the same tone I had used throughout the evening, but now it carried something else, something they had not heard from me before, not resistance, not anger, but certainty. Daniel nodded slowly, offering a small smile that did not quite settle. "That is good," he said. "It is always best to be informed." I met his gaze without hesitation. "I agree," I replied, and then I added, "which is why I made some adjustments, this time." The reaction was immediate, not dramatic, but undeniable. Emily looked at me fully for the first time that evening, her expression shifting from polite distance to something more focused, more concerned. "Adjustments," she repeated, her voice careful. "What kind of adjustments?" I folded my hands lightly in front of me, not defensive, not closed off, just composed, the kind that ensure everything remains exactly where it should be, I said, and I watched as Daniel's expression changed, just slightly, the confidence still there, but now edged with calculation, as if he were quickly reassessing what he thought he understood. "I am not sure I follow," he said, his tone still even, but more deliberate now. I allowed a small pause before answering, not to create suspense, but because there was no reason to rush. "Access has been clarified," I said, "control has been reinforced, and any assumptions about how things might unfold over time have been corrected." Emily's breath caught softly, almost inaudible, but I noticed it, and Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers no longer tapping, his stillness now mirroring my own. "That sounds thorough," he said, choosing his words carefully, and I nodded once. "It is," I replied, and then I picked up my glass, taking a small sip before setting it back down with the same quiet precision. "I realized something recently," I continued, my tone unchanged. "Time does not belong to those who wait for it, it belongs to those who understand how to use it." Neither of them responded immediately, and in that silence, I could see it clearly, not confusion, but recognition, the slow understanding that whatever they had been expecting was no longer certain, that the path they believed was already set had shifted without their awareness, and I did not need to explain further. I did not need to outline details or defend decisions, because the truth had already settled into the space between us, calm, unspoken, and irreversible. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my posture relaxed, my expression unchanged, and for the first time since that day in the office, I felt no need to observe, no need to anticipate, because everything that needed to be understood already was. And as the evening continued, the conversation moving carefully around the edges of what had been said, I allowed myself a quiet certainty, not in what they might do next, but in what I had already done, because I had let them believe I was standing still, and that had been their first mistake.